And welcome to this week's edition of Reigns on the Cardinals podcast. Rob Reigns, Mike Reigns, STLSportsPage.com, coming to you for the final time this spring from our spring training headquarters hotel here at the Homewood Suites in Palm Beach Gardens. Mike, good morning as we tape this broadcast. A week to go in spring training, less than that here in Florida before the Cardinals will break camp on Sunday. NCAA basketball tournament underway. It's a busy but exciting time of the year.
It is very exciting, yeah, for sure. I don't know if you got up and watched the Dodgers and the Padres kick off in Seoul this morning, but everything is getting underway and getting going.
I did kind of join the game about the seventh inning. I was not up for the first pitch of the game, but did see the latter part of it. I guess that's a good thing. I mean, I kind of glad the Cardinals aren't one of the teams playing in that series, but I understand the concept of trying to glow the game globally and to bring attention. It certainly looked like everybody in the crowd in South Korea was having a good time.
And it seems like, for the Padres and the Dodgers both having guys that have connections over there is fun and exciting for them too.
Of course, the Cardinals and Dodgers will get it started for real for the Cardinals next Thursday in Los Angeles, the first of 4 games, then followed, of course, by 3 games in San Diego. And, we kind of have eyeballed that April schedule as we've talked, throughout the winter, and you saw the gauntlet that the Cardinals are going to have to face. But now that it's getting closer to reality here, I think it's still a pretty imposing schedule.
I think that you want them to come out hot and you want them to come out well, but you also have to be cautious of that April schedule, right? So if they leave with a 500 record at the end of April, you're probably not overly excited. But if you look back, you're probably not too distraught either based on who they were playing.
We'll get to that kind of comments to that in a second. We're going to talk mostly on the podcast about some of the roster decisions that they're looming here for the Cardinals in the last few days. So they break into camp, as we mentioned, on Sunday, and then we'll play the 2 games against the Cubs in Arizona before heading to Los Angeles. I don't think they'll have the full roster set by Sunday. I think they're going to have to wait till after those couple games in Arizona. They may have it in their own minds about who the 26 are going to be for Thursday, but I don't think we'll know that for sure until after the last exhibition game next Tuesday. But the first thing a business to attend to is the one thing that we do know that has changed since our last broadcast here on Reigns on the Cardinals podcast is that they've given manager Ali Marmol a 2-year contract extension. What's your initial reaction and thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the initial comment is, why right now after losing 91 games last year do you give him an extension now? But I also think Mo wants to show that he has confidence in his manager and knows that he's got the right guy, and so he doesn't want him to have to worry about, hey, don't worry about anything else other than just going out there and performing and winning the game. I think a lot of people worry about, why do you give him the extension now? But Schilt had an extension too, and that didn't seem to matter based on the results there. So maybe it's not as important or big of a detail as we're looking into it.
I think part of it's 2 things. I think number one is I think they're concerned about some of the injuries that they're going to have to start the season. We know Edmonds going to be on the injured list. I'm pretty confident that we can predict that Lars Nootbaar is going to be on the injured list at the start of the season. We know Keenan Middleton is going to be on the injured list. You don't know about Sonny Gray yet. We'll talk more about him here in a second. But I think that's a factor. I think also the factor of the tough schedule, like we talked about, opening the year with 7 games in Los Angeles and San Diego. You come home and play the Marlins and the Diamondbacks. I really don't think and not to say the Cardinals predict this is going to happen, but just for hype, just to kind of put it hypothetically, if the Cardinals start out this season 3-13 after those first 16 games, what would be the first thing that would happen if Ali had not signed this extension? Are they going to fire the manager? And I just don't think they wanted to put that pressure on him. And as John Mosaic talked about in the press conference last Friday when they announced the deal was that they as they made the decisions, they sat in meetings. They didn't want some of the decisions that they made that would be a short-term decision based on a better decision being something that would benefit the team long-term if they felt like they had to win and win right now in order to keep his job. So I think it makes sense. I would rather seen him have some success early on this season before doing it. I understand why they did it and the timing behind it. So, and as I think the other thing, as you mentioned, is just because he signed a 2-year contract extension doesn't mean that if this team is 20 games under 500 in July, that there might still not be another decision made at some point.
And I could be wrong in this thinking too, but I would tend to think, if this team goes out and loses another 90 games this year, something happens. I don't know that, in my opinion, is not 100% on Ali, but more on Mo, because that's who put this team together, right?
Correct.
And so, as a manager, he can only do so much with how the players perform. And so I think at some point you got to look back and say, okay, who brought in these pitchers of Lynn and Gibson and Gray, and how did they perform? Is that Ollie or is that Mo? And I think you got to take a look at the latter there.
I think if they have a year similar to last year, there's going to be all kinds of changes. I don't think you're going to recognize this team a year from now and the front office a year from now. If and not to predict it, but if something like that were to happen. All right, let's shift our focus and get to a little bit more of the present situation right now, and that's the decisions that the Cardinals have to make coming up. As we mentioned, I think you'll probably see some more roster cuts before we get to Sunday and the team breaks camp. I don't think you're going to be down to 26 by Sunday night. But the biggest decision I think the Cardinals have to make, and we've talked about it pretty much all spring training, but as we get closer to making the decision, I want to get your thoughts on what do you think they do with Victor Scott II?
Yeah, I think that's the real question mark, right? Do you bring him up and start him in center, or do you try to bide the time with a guy like Alec Burleson and Michael Ciani? I think the question mark depends how long do you think Edman and Nootbaar are going to be out, and what's your plan for them when they come back? Because if Victor Scott is here, he needs to be your everyday center fielder because of the player that he is. So if Edman comes back and Scott's still here, do you want to send him back to Memphis after starting his clock? Or do you give him the spot and not Edman? And I think that's the question mark they have to figure out. Now, Alec Burleson is doing everything that he can this spring to kind of, make them force their hand to make him stay here too, because he's playing very well.
Yeah, I think this. I think that as well as Victor Scott has played, I just think, in my mind, in my own opinion, I've not gotten this information from anybody else. It's just my observation, is that Victor Scott II probably begins the year in Memphis. And I think there's some number of reasons for that. It has nothing to do with Victor Scott's spring. He's had a terrific spring. I don't want to say he's opened eyes because I think he's played about the way that the Cardinals expected him to play. I've seen him play in Springfield last year. I saw him play in the Fall League last year. He's this good a player, but he's also 23 years old. He also has about 3 months, 2.5 months of Double-A experience, no games in Triple-A. I think it's 163 career games that he's played in the minor league. So he's still really, an inexperienced player. And had they had a need, and if they thought Edman, like just for example, say Edman had Tommy John surgery, he was going to be out for the season. I think that changes the picture. But I think you have some options. Scott is not on the 40-man roster. That's always a factor. Number two is you have, Carlson, you have Burleson, you have Ciani, you have Brendan Donovan who could play left field. You have Nootbaar probably going to be out maybe 2 weeks. I bet he's back by the middle of April if I had to predict. So then you're only talking about filling one spot and you have those guys. So I just think it's the Cardinals, as we've seen traditionally, and I'm not saying it's the right decision, but I think if you look at historically what the Cardinals have done when they faced with a decision like this, they go I don't want to call it the easy way, but the traditional way, the safe way with making roster decisions. And that would be to play Carlson in center and either Donovan or Burleson in left with Ciani coming in for defense late in the game. You also could DH Burleson and play Donovan in left. And then when Nootbaar comes back, you can have that option of still playing Carlson in center, Nootbaar in left. So I just think for the short term, if they think, Edman's going to be back potentially by the end of April, then that's what they do. So it'll be interesting to see. But that's, to me, they've got some other roster decisions to make, but the biggest one is what they do with Victor Scott II. And that's what I predict is going to happen.
The other option they have too is really depending on how long they think Edman's going to be out, right? Because you could put Edman on the 60-day IL, which opens up a 40-man spot for Victor Scott. So
Correct.
There are routes to get him on that without making a lot of other moves. The question is just going to be how long do they think Edman's actually going to be out, or when is he going to be ready to play?
And here's the other part of that decision, though, too, is if you start Scott in AAA, okay, say the other outfielders that you keep up here are struggling. Say you get toward the end of April and you find out, okay, Edman's going to miss another month. Then what's the worst thing that could happen? You promote Victor Scott at that time. And in the meantime, he's been playing every day for a month in AAA. I really don't see a downside to keeping him in Memphis to start the year. And I say that as a Victor Scott fan. I think he impacts the game. I think he's a terrific center fielder. I think he's, obviously going to be an exciting player on the bases. I'd love to see him in St. Louis and love to see his style of baseball. I mean, obviously, I kind of cut my teeth as a baseball writer covering the Whitey Herzog Cardinals in the 1980s. And I mean, there's nothing more exciting than watching Vince and Willie and Ozzie run around the bases. Triple became a really exciting play with those guys. So I'd love to see that style of baseball back in St. Louis, and I think you can win with that style of baseball. But I don't think necessarily it has to start in April here's the thing about let's look at it from this perspective. You promote Victor Scott the second. He's playing great. It's time for Tommy Edman to come back. Then what do you do?
Yeah, you got a lot of question marks for sure. Because the other guy who hasn't been playing great right now is Carlson. But you got to remember too, like we've talked about before, Carlson's only 24 years old too. So there is some learning curves there a little bit too. But if everybody else is playing like they should, then can you get by with a month of Burleson and Carlson and Donovan, flip flopping it? Probably, right?
So those decisions kind of tend to generally work themselves out. We always say a team, well, how are you going to have you got too many pitchers? You don't need that many pitchers. Well, yes, you do. At some point during the season, all these guys are going to play. They're going to play well for a while. They're going to not play well for a while. And those things, somebody's going to get hurt. Somebody's going to get healthy. And those things just tend to generally work themselves out over time. So anyway, that decision is,
as we talk about, other guys playing like they should play, the one guy that, is you're certainly not worried about, he's going to get it going, but hasn't looked great this spring is Paul Goldschmidt.
Correct.
And you're really obviously counting on him to be the huge key piece in this lineup because him and Arenado really didn't do what they needed to do last year. And so if those guys can step up, it allows guys like Carlson or Victor Scott or, Mason Wynn to maybe have a little bit of a slower start or not be as huge of a piece of the offense if Goldie's hitting 300 and not hitting $150 like he is this spring.
Yeah, I'm still willing to give the veterans the benefit of the doubt in spring training. I mean, it's kind of like we've talked about this off the air, and we're going to talk about the starting pitching here in just a second. But to me, if a guy's a veteran, he has a track record of doing it. You know that he's physically healthy. There's not any injury concerns. Spring training to them is just a matter of working on things. And the fact that Goldschmidt's hitting 200 or whatever it is, it doesn't really concern me at this point. If he's hitting 200 at the end of April, then we maybe have to have another conversation. But I'm willing to give all those guys the benefit of the doubt. It's the young players who really kind of have to establish themselves and prove that they can hit and succeed at this level that you kind of pay more attention to when you worry about in spring training.
And it's one of those where obviously, the results of spring training don't matter, right? So you don't know what guys are working on or trying to, correct. And so obviously it's not something to worry about, like you said, until that happens in April. But it's just worth noting that, those are two guys that you really need to step up. And it's similar to, kind of guys needing to step up in the starting rotation too.
Correct. Yeah, Kyle Gibson came into his start on Tuesday with a 12.60 ERA, gave up 7 earned runs in 5 innings, and saw his ERA go down. So that's the kind of spring he's had. He said physically, he's fine. He wishes the numbers were better, but he thinks physically he's fine, and that's what he's concerned about. He said there's things he did, like in the game yesterday, that he wouldn't do during a the regular season start, as far as pitch selection and execution and things like that. So again, we have to give those guys, him, Steven Matz, Lance Lynn, kind of the benefit of the doubt. I mean, Sonny Gray's in a different category because he only pitched 4 innings, I think, this spring because of the injury. So we have to see about him. But the other guys in that rotation, I think you just have to kind of hope that they're can turn it around, and spring training numbers will be a thing of the past once we get into the regular season.
And I think the other question you have to look at too is how much of these guys all pitched with Contreras, because in spring you're working in other catchers and getting guys there too. And, I know one of Kyle Gibson's starts wasn't with Contreras behind the plate. So does that make a little bit of a difference, in pitch selection and things like that too? And, it also begs the question of this team hired Yachty to come and be a consultant and be here and help the team. And he's not, how much of a difference would he help these guys and help Wilson trying to help with the pitch selection too? And, maybe that leans it a little more to the Ollie extension there because, Yachty not being here. But, I think it's something that the starting pitching is not looking and not doing what we need it to do so far.
The 2 best starters the Cardinals have had this spring have been Miles Michaelis, who will replace Sonny Gray as the opening day starter, and Zach Thompson. I mean, Zach Thompson, came to camp saying, I want to be a starter, and I think he's earned that right. Now, whether he's just starting in place of Gray the first couple of times through the rotation, or if they go with the 6th starter as him, I think he deserves to be one of the 5 or 6 starting pitchers when this season begins in Los Angeles. He's pitched really, really well.
And obviously the ERA is something that, we all want to pay attention to because it's an easy number to wrap our head around and wrap our minds around. But it's also hard to know when watching a guy in spring is he focusing on a new pitch, or is he focusing on hey, can I get outs with my breaking ball on 2 strikes? Or, what are we trying to work on specifically? And like Kyle Gibson said the other day, that he made decisions in that game that he probably wouldn't make if the game mattered, like in April for the regular season, so he's trying to try new things to see, does this pitch work in this situation, or does this type of pitch work in this situation? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I think the real test comes that first month of April when we start to get guys through the first and second time through the rotation.
And I think the Cardinals are also banking on Sonny Gray. At some point, here's the latest on him is he's scheduled to throw a live batting practice. I believe it'll be on Thursday. And if all that goes well, he could be used in one of those 2 games in Arizona, probably, which would line him up to pitch either at the end of the Los Angeles series or the first part of the series in San Diego. So he really would not even be missing a start. He would just be pushed back in the rotation. I think that's the best case scenario for the Cardinals, even if he can't go up to 80 or 85 pitches in that first start. If he can give you 60 to 65, maybe, I think then build off of that, the Cardinals will take that. So that's what I think is going to happen with Sonny Gray, is that he will avoid the injury list, but won't pitch on opening day, but should hopefully be able to pitch later on in that first road trip. And we'll know more depending on how his outing goes on Thursday to the live BP session, and then how he recovers after that on Friday and Saturday. But that's their thinking. That's the plan as of now.
And a lot of these starters, their first time through the rotation in the actual season, aren't going to go very deep in games anyways, because their arm's just not there. So if Sonny Gray can come back and give you 60, 65 pitches in that first start, I think you would take it without missing any time. I think you would rather 65 pitches out of him than, say, Matthew Liberatore starting right now.
Or you don't want to get a situation where you're going to be in the bullpen in the third inning, basically. So this is Rob Raines, Mike Raines, our Raines on the Cardinals podcast here on STLSportsPage.com. As we talked a week to go in less than a week to go in Florida, and then just a week away from opening day in Los Angeles. The other decisions, of course, that loom, and we talked about this even before camp opened. We talked about all throughout spring training. The biggest decisions I think this team has to make is how you fill the open spots in the bullpen, and who stepped up, who's pitched well this spring, who has struggled this spring. And I think that's still an open book as to how they're going to fill those jobs. And one of the interesting things to me, well, 2 things. One is I think Riley O'Brien has won a spot. They haven't said that. They haven't told him that he's on the team. But based on the way he has pitched this spring and how everybody else has performed, I would be shocked if he's not one of the 8 relievers in this season, especially with the injury to Keenan Middleton. We know he's going to start the year on the injury list. We don't know how long he's going to be out, but that will open up a spot for somebody to make it who might not have made it otherwise.
And one of the guys that's really been kind of surprising to me is JoJo Romero, because last year he was lights out and really good, and he hasn't really looked that solid this spring yet. He's getting hard hit, a pretty decent amount. And so the question is, what's there from last year. So does he get it in just on that ability alone? And I think so. Those are some of the decisions that Mo and the staff are all going to make as you're looking at this team is, what have these guys done in the regular season too, as well as how they look this spring?
I think there's 3 guys that you could put into that category who are candidates for spots. One of them is Romero, as you mentioned, who is out of options. That's also a consideration. The other one, John King, one of the left-hander that they acquired from Texas as part of the Montgomery trade last year, who pitched pretty well last year, the last part of the season, but has been consistent spring training, especially early on, was struggling. He's pitched better of late. And then you have Andre Palante, who we've seen up here for a couple of years now, who they like as a right-hander who pitches well against left-handed batters, and he's worked on a new curveball, and they're happy with how that's progressed. So I think one of the things you have to weigh is which do you give more weigh more heavily? The fact the guy who pitched for you a year ago and how they pitched in the regular season a year ago versus how they pitched in spring training. Which one is the juggling act of how you pick the bullpen based on which performance that you evaluate more?
And when you look at JoJo specifically, I mean, like you said, he's out of options. And last year he looked great that second half of the season, right? I mean, he really was a big key piece of that bullpen to help where it was. But this spring, it hasn't been there. And so that's the question mark for them to determine is what's more important.
And if you put Thompson in the rotation, then you have a decision to make about Matthew Liberatore. Is he going to go into the bullpen? Is he going to go to Memphis and start? So you have another starter ready if you need him. Drew Rom is in the same position. He's obviously been a starter, but they think he has a chance maybe to be a reliever, or he could go to Memphis and start. And then you have a guy like Ryan Fernandez, who was a Rule 5 pickup from Boston. He has to be kept on your 40-man or 25-man roster, 26-man roster for the entire season, or he has to be offered back to the Red Sox. So that's a factor. He's another guy that's in that ball. So they have probably maybe realistically, and Nick Robertson was one of the pitchers that they acquired from Boston in the trade that sent Tyler O'Neill to the Red Sox. He's also in the category. So I think you've got about 5 or 6 guys kind of in that limbo spot who's we go into the final days in Florida competing for 2 or maybe 3 spots. So we talked about that battle being the most interesting one all spring, and it's still going to be that down to the final stretch here.
And Kenyon Middleton being hurt opens up another spot too. So you've got a spot there for a little bit until he comes back. But yeah, there's you've got some question marks. I think as we've talked about here that, in the final week of spring here, you've got a really tough spot with what do you do in center field and left field, and what do you do with these last 2 or 3 bullpen spots. I think they've got some tough decisions to make.
And if you ask anybody on any major league team as they get to this point in spring training, their number one goal is not to get anybody else hurt. You just want to get out of camp as healthy as you can and be ready to start the season. So two things I want to mention before we wrap this show up. One is that we really appreciate all of our sponsors, Drury Hotels, Archwell Health, AAA Travel Missouri, and we are welcoming our new sponsor, Rawlings Sports and Rawlings Sporting Goods, and their new museum that's coming to Westport Plaza. You're going to be hearing a lot more about that on our podcast and on our website here as we go into April. We appreciate their support. And then as well, of course, thanks to all of the viewers and listeners. We've had a lot of nice comments from people that we run into down here in spring training about how much they enjoy our broadcast, and we really appreciate all the feedback and all the comments that we've been receiving about this. So one of the other things that we mentioned to it right off the top of the show, Mike, is the NCAA basketball tournament underway. For several years now, we've run a bracket contest here on our website. First place prize will be a great prize package, including 2 free nights stay at any Drury hotel in the country. So appreciate everybody who signed up. If you were signed up last year through the CBS Sports website, you should have automatically received a notice about this year's brackets challenge. You can fill out your bracket. We don't count the play-in games, so you've got up until the first game starts just after 11 a.m. on Thursday morning, St. Louis time, to get your bracket filled out. So encourage everybody to do it. And no experience necessary, because we all know that even if you think you know a lot about college basketball, sometimes it doesn't play out in your bracket.
I will say this, though. If you need your one upset pick for this year, it's going to be Samford, the 13 seed over KU.
Oh, that hurts.
Unfortunately, I know it hurts, but KU dropping the news of McCullough not playing is going to make a big difference there. And the last few years, a 13 seed has overtaken a 4. So
I actually think that I've got him winning that game, but I've got him losing in round 2. So that's just kind of the way I think this season's gone. My KU Jayhawks. So it's always fun to watch.
As we have said here, you could flip a coin on a lot of these games because
Sure.
Nobody ever thought that UMBC would beat Virginia as a 16 seed. So there's a lot of things that can happen.
That's why we love this time of year, spring training getting to ready to wrap up, the regular season getting underway, March Madness in full bore. So it's always fun to talk about, and we'll be watching these last few days till we break camp and get back to get this regular season underway. So Mike, thanks for the visit as always, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. Thanks for giving our other coverage here on STLSportsPage.com. Reporting for the Rains on the Cardinals podcast from Jupiter, Florida, Rob Rains, STLSportsPage.com. Have a great day, everyone.